No.
Oh, I don't have money.
Okay.
Feel free to browse.
Who's outside? Where can I learn two-handed?
Ask a weapon trainer. They'll tell you.
Oh, you're right.
Probably Iron Forge.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, Iron Forge.
Alright, did you check? Oh,
Yeah. Sorry.
And his family
Okay.
would all perish. Rick heard this, he was still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones, and so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what
I
the
got a
plan
bunch of
was
food
for
before I
that
go.
night to break this hex. Basically,
Chilling.
Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say
A
to the
stack of
spirits in
clams.
the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice that Rick and David knew. Now, it was a different... In 2005, in a little town in Illinois, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, walked into this strange living room inside of an apartment where on the ground was this circle of lit candles. And the trio, without saying anything, just marched into this circle of candles and took seats cross-legged on the ground, all looking inward toward each other. Then, after sitting there for a second, it was like suddenly the air in the room seemed to change, and when that happened, the woman began to speak. Except it wasn't her voice. It was like this dark, guttural voice that almost sounded like a man speaking, but it was clearly coming out of her mouth. But the 2 men who were sitting in the circle watching this woman, they were
Seems like a lot of people are
expecting
waiting
this.
around
They
for it.
sat there listening intently for their instructions. And then after they got their instructions, the 2 men waited for the woman to stop talking, and when she did, she handed them a special tool for the ritual. And then the 2 men stood up, they said their goodbyes, they turned around, marched outside, hopped in the car, and began driving.
Just
towards their
leveling
car.
no,
But before we get into
because
that very
I don't
bizarre
wanna-
story,
well,
if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format,
They're gonna be in
you've
Red
come to
Ridge.
the
There's gonna be a lot of
place,
horde.
because
That's what I was
all we do,
thinking. I don't know.
and we upload
Looks
once a
worth
week.
it.
So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button has just finished raking up all of their fallen leaves in their yard, break out your leaf blower and obliterate all of their piles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was
that's
Amy
right, yeah,
Connor,
okay.
and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner. And Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment,
Good luck.
Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles.
Yeah, elixir defense.
And
I
as soon as
need
Rick and
4
David
of them.
stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things. Like
Ooh,
practicing
yeah,
evil
that's the
magic,
fucking worst.
evil witchcraft.
Yeah,
And so
that
this
is exactly
coven,
what you mean.
led by Irenia, was actually in
Yeah.
place to
Yeah.
try to
Fuck
combat
that shit.
these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform
yeah.
their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt
I
to
have all the
break
other
a
mats.
powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the 2 slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these 2 candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant, and so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat 2, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast, and the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love, and so of course that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irenia to other witches in this
What
coven
brings
who
you
actually
here?
were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before and he could do it again for
Go in
them.
peace.
As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in this circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them, and as he stared
Your
at the
skill
flames
at
dancing
brewing
across the top
potions
of them,
needs to
Rick
be
started to
greater
feel
before
like he
you
was
can
kind of
become one
drifting
of my
off into a
students.
trance-like
In the
state.
meantime,
And he
perhaps
knew
Sylvana
that based on
Forestmoon
his
or
prior
Millefera
teachings
and
from
Cora can help
Irenia,
you
the
just
leader of
over
his
there.
heaven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and
Ooh,
David
I need
that the
elixir of
curse was
defense,
still
not
growing.
minor.
And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said again in that
Yeah.
slow, strange voice,
You hide up all of that one,
was
yeah.
also on Rick and his entire
Ooh, that's a high
family.
level.
And if they didn't break this hex
Alright, never mind.
immediately,
You have only
Rick
to
and
ask.
his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state,
Pretty close,
but his
though.
heart began
Close
racing
soon.
because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones, and so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex. And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, blessed be. And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment.
Not yet, no.
As soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place. And he knew
I was
right
gonna
then
see
and there
what-
that
I think
he
I
and
had a
David
quest
would be
somewhere to
safe
turn
that
in.
night, because clearly the
For
shadows moving
Hunter
around
stuff.
had to be those 5 demons that Irenia
Yeah,
had
I'm
called
sure I
forth
know where it was.
from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. The other day, old Seagull Lung was looking pretty down, and so naturally, I offered him some of my iced wildebeest retinas to suck on, but he just shook his head and said, Dad, thank you, but what I really need right now is, a bloodthirsty horde of zombies to descend on this town so I can savagely destroy them with various DIY weaponry. But alas, zombies aren't real, and so my dream will never come true. And at this point, I just slapped Lung right across the face, and I said, Lung, are you kidding me? You ever heard of a little thing called DLS? Doomsday Last Survivor? You kidding me?
Ooh,
We
actually,
literally have
we should
trillions
queue
of
up for some
zombies we can
BGs.
slaughter right now. You kidding me? Come here. Let me explain to you what this
'cause we
is.
can
In
get a
Doomsday,
shit
you
ton of
enter a
XP
dark,
and
post-apocalyptic
gold.
world filled with your beloved bloodthirsty
For that-
zombies, and it's up to you
for
to
that quest.
strategize and survive their wrath. You can customize shelters, and you
Oh,
can
yeah.
even recruit heroes with
We
their
might
own
scale.
special abilities
Might
that
scale,
will help
right?
you
It'll
slaughter
scale.
all these
Probably it'll
zombies. And right now,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
have a chance at some of the $5,000
Yeah, you're
cash
right.
that's up for grabs for playing this game. You can be a lone survivor,
Yeah,
or
it
you can
says-
join
it
forces
says
with
it's
other
not
players and
fucking-
alliances to try to withstand the zombie invasion.
Yeah,
Heck, if you get lucky, you might even be able to join me and old Seagull Lung's alliance. And for a limited time only, you can earn a special rare name
I mean, on the
tag
bright side,
that
at least
shows
you
off
lose
your part of
fast
the
and the
Ballin'
games will be over
Squad when you
fast.
download the
Maintain
game
our
using
link to
my
the
link.
mainland
And
via
remember,
typical,
there's $5,000
constantly
cash
still get
up
the
for
points
grabs
for it,
right now.
and the
To
XP,
potentially
and the gold.
win some of that money, click the link in the description below, download
But
the game, and then in the
just
page,
get
you'll
wrecked
see
for,
there's
like,
something called a
an
merit
hour.
ranking, and the top 3 people in that ranking walk away
Are you already
with up to
flying?
$1,000 each.
Oh, you're going there,
Outside of that
unfortunately.
ranking, many other players will be chosen for cash
I
prizes,
had to
some
go.
up to
Where'd I have to
$100
go?
each. Hurry and download Doomsday right now so you can join the limited time events and earn the legendary hero Jaden. The next zombie wave arrives in 8 hours, so come and join me and old Seagull Vlog now!
Right.
A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger, lived, a 20-year-old army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's